Okay, so we're ready for our first poll question. In your opinion, I have a lot going on in the federal government right now. In your opinion, where should the federal government be placing its emphasis? On water quality or water quantity? Water quality or water quantity? And Mark Pfeiffer, you can only vote once. Water quantity or water quality? Okay, probably not too surprising, but a good healthy percentage of folks think that focus ought to be on water quality. So that's good. So yep. Okay, our next question. Many of you know that the Bureau of Reclamation and the Interior itself actually is going through a major reorganization. And our next question has to do with splitting the Colorado up into 3 regions. So Kelly, can we bring up the next question? There we go. So, right now, or before this, Colorado's been kind of in 2 regions. And so the current plan is to reorganize and split Colorado into 3 regions. Do you think this is a good thing or not? If you think it's a good thing, yes, which is A. B is no way. C, people don't want to admit to anything, or it's early, and yeah, so they don't want to get comment. And D, I'm not exactly sure. So again, A is yes, B is no way, and C is I'm not sure. Interesting. A lot of uncertainty about what that might mean for Colorado. Is that going to improve or not improve access? Yeah, so, okay. All right. With that, we are ready to start with our program, and we're going to, on our Water Congress board, we have Christine Arbogast, who is our Federal Affairs Liaison on the CWC board. Also sitting here at the head table is 2 distinguished people, Andy Colosimo and Chris Tree. So they're our chair and our vice chair of our Federal Affairs Committee. But Christine, if you're ready, we'll get started.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for getting up bright and early, as you always do for this Federal Affairs session. As Doug mentioned, Andy Colosimo and Chris Trees are also part of the Federal Affairs team for Colorado Water Congress, as is Kathy Kitzman. The 3 of them are NWRA board members for the state of Colorado. And of course, we are excited to have kind of a new member of the Federal Affairs team in Chene Polo, who is running government affairs for the Water Congress now. I want to just real quickly remind you that NWRA is having its spring meeting in Washington, D.C., starting on April 9th. The Water Congress always hosts a luncheon for the Colorado congressional delegation, staff, and we have about a 2-hour really good roundtable discussion. And all of the offices participate. It's really a good time to get to know the staff that works on the issues of interest to you in the DC offices. So please consider attending that NWRA meeting, and in particular the Water Congress congressional briefing. So the Federal Affairs team is really pleased to have 2 young professional Senate Staff Committee members as our guest speakers this morning. One works on the Republican side of the aisle and one on the Democratic side. These 2 gentlemen embody what you would love to be hearing about Washington, D.C. today, but aren't. They are honest and straightforward. They're respectful and have a healthy dose of humility, but do not think they have the world by the tail. They understand that bipartisanship is a required element of a successful legislative program and not just a buzzword. They're intellectual, but they have an enormous well of common sense. They are mature, and they get the water and natural resources needs of the West. Lane Dixon serves Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee Chairman Lisa Murkowski as the lead staff person on water resources, mining, and hydropower. Lane's professional background includes a stint at the Bureau of Reclamation and another at the House Subcommittee on Water and Power. Before joining the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, he spent 10 years as the Washington, D.C.-based federal affairs representative for the Salt River Project in Arizona. And I was very proud to work with him as my vice chair of the NWRA Federal Affairs Committee. He's a graduate of the University of California, Davis, and holds a master's degree from George Mason University. Many of you know our second speaker, Sean Babington, who worked as Senator Michael Bennett's senior policy advisor on energy and natural resources issues. He now serves as a senior professional staffer for the Senate Ag Committee Democrats, focusing his work on forestry, climate, smart agriculture, and pesticides. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of Colorado and holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. And both of these two guys do this grueling work while raising young families with their lovely wives. Not easy if you have any clue what the work day is like in Washington, D.C. Lane will offer a forecast on the Senate Energy Committee's year ahead, but bear in mind, a forecast is what you see when you watch the weather report. Not always predictable or accurate. And Sean will try to accurately predict the future of the 2018 Farm Bill deliberations, but with the same caveat. Sean will also join the next panel to discuss forest health and watershed management issues. So with that, I'm going to ask Lane to come up to the podium. When they are both done, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A, and there'll be roaming mics out in the audience. So please welcome Sean and Lane.
Thanks, Christine. It's good to be with you all, and good morning. I'm glad you made that comment about the forecasting and kind of the caveat on its accuracy. I think one of the last times I was in Denver was for the NWRA conference, where we were getting the forecast on the upcoming El Nino and how awesome and great it was going to be, which never happened. And then the next year, when we were expecting the La Nina and having dry conditions, we had this great water year. So I think hopefully my forecast can be a little bit more accurate, but it's pretty much in the range of those experts that can call the weather. As Christine mentioned, I work for Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska on her Energy and Natural Resources Committee staff. And as a Republican staffer, I obviously take my cues from all of my bosses. And so I think the main takeaway I hope you all have from my talk is thank you, or you're welcome, for your big, beautiful tax return that you're going to get next year. And with that, I'm open to any questions. No, I'm kidding. But I do hear a lot about that. Now, I'll hit on the committee's agenda a little bit, what we're looking at for the upcoming year, some of the challenges and opportunities that I see at least, and then step aside so we can get some questions down the road. Really, as we head into this second session, our agenda honestly looks a lot like it did at the beginning of the first session. Namely, we have a lot of nominations that we have to process still, and there are beautiful visions of infrastructure packages that everybody is thinking about. So I think those two things will really be our primary focus. While we're very happy that we got the Interior's water team confirmed with Tim Petty and Brenda Berman last year, we still have a lot of work to do on nominations in our committee. It's unfortunate. We're trying to process things quickly, but we're even having to process some that we did last year that had to be renominated because they didn't make it off the floor. So We have eight of the 14 interior nominees that come before the committee still need to be confirmed. If you look at the DOE, the Department of Energy and independent commissions that we have to deal with, that over doubles, and it's just something we need to do. It takes up a lot of time and bandwidth from the committee, and so it's a reality we have to deal with, not just because it's absolutely part of our duty, but also the administration needs its full team. In that group is a number of bureau heads and other high-ranking folks that they need to get things moving over there. So we'll continue to focus on that. But at the same time, there's still a major priority that we're putting on infrastructure. And I think we're hearing that from both sides of the aisle. We started with a similar focus last year. Throughout the year last year, it was at the top of the agenda. We had a number of hearings. Chris Trees testified at one early in the year about infrastructure needs in the water sector. We've had hearings on permit streamlining and all kinds of infrastructure-related issues. At the subcommittee level, the Water and Power Subcommittee, we've looked at water supply infrastructure, on financing, and we've looked at tidal transfers and groundwater aquifer storage and things like that. And so, I mean, that's all to say, really, that there's a lot of groundwork that has been laid on infrastructure, and it certainly feels like the issue is ripe and that we're looking to turn to that in the near term. Between the kind of leaked 6-page summary that came out of the White House, I think it was last week or earlier this week, briefings that I know are going on with leadership on infrastructure, and of course the State of the Union coming up, which seems like a perfect place to launch something if it's a real priority. It just feels like we're on the verge of maybe really turning to this, or at least having a starting place that we can go. What's less clear, at least to me, is exactly the scope and the approach that's going to be taken on infrastructure. The kind of leaked document that I referenced takes more of a programmatic approach, where you're looking at incentives for private financing, private investment, streamlining, things like that. But on the other hand, there's been lists of nationally significant projects that have been solicited, and of course Congress is going to have a major say in that. They'll have the ultimate say, and there's a lot of ideas there. So where that goes and kind of the approach that's taken isn't completely clear. So we'll have to see and wait on that. For Chairman Murkowski's part, her Energy and Natural Resources Act is really the starting place on infrastructure. That's a bipartisan bill she reintroduced this year with Senator Cantwell, that passed the Senate last year. And it has a lot of stuff in there, a lot on hydro relicensing, permit streamlining for pipelines and transmission lines and things like that. But really, between the summary document out of the White House and that bill, there's not a whole lot on Western water at this point. I mean, there's some things in there, certainly, but it's pretty light. So with that in mind, I think the good news is that we have a lot of good Western senators that I've been working with. I mean, Senator Gardner, of course, Barrasso, Flake, Risch, that have in our committee been very vocal about the need to include and prioritize Western water supply in any infrastructure package. And I fully expect that they'll really carry our issues into that conversation when it occurs. So we continuing to work with those offices. I think one of the prerequisites really, and it's on us in many ways, is making sure they know exactly what we want. I think the number one way we can miss the train on infrastructure is not having a thought out, buttoned up proposal on what we need. I think a lot of other committees and sectors will have that, and that we're going to need to provide that in order to be part of the conversation. So with that in mind, we've been working on putting together a package. To my previous comment, it's really what we're looking at currently is really kind of on that programmatic approach. I mean, looking at bureau-wide, West-wide programs that can be implemented to help water infrastructure in general, and less on the project-specific type of things. There's a number of reasons for that, but really the number one, well, not the number one, but in the list of reasons is that if the exercise turns into more of a kind of money party where we're looking at projects, I have no doubt that I will hear about everybody's projects and that can come together quickly. I think these programmatic programs take a lot more effort to work through, and so we need to put in the time now to make sure that we get them right. They work for everybody in the West, and they'll be ultimately effective if they get enacted. So as I mentioned, we're putting together a water supply package based on the roundtables and hearings that we've had to date, and it's going to focus in three main areas. We're hoping we'll be able to roll something out and start vetting it with both the Democratic side of the aisle and you all in the next week or two. The three big categories are water supply infrastructure, water management improvements, and water supply certainty. I think the supply infrastructure speaks for itself. Storage, conveyance, recycling, you name it, whatever it is, we have to invest in our infrastructure, our supply infrastructure, to get us to supply water for growth, for climate change, for everything, all the needs, all the things that you're doing every day. We have to do that, and we see the consequences in many states when we have a major drought, when we don't make those investments. So that'll be a major focus. In that bucket, we're looking at storage streamlining, permit streamlining. The reality is right now the permitting process for a lot of water projects, it's too complicated and it's too costly. It's making projects uneconomic. We hear it every day. But I think more importantly, it's so unpredictable that it's causing people to take potentially good projects off the table way too early in the planning process. And I think if we can add some certainty to the tail end of the process, we can have more of a kind of storage agnostic conversation about water supply, and so that's going to be a goal, and I think that it will be in whatever first proposal we have at least. Financing is another of the big issues as we continue to look at dwindling appropriations. The kind of old model of reclamation funding especially is becoming more and more difficult. Getting that upfront appropriation and then repaying it over time is a difficult strategy for financing water projects now. So we'd like to look at other opportunities to have the federal government support water development on the borrowing side, whether it's access or cost of capital issues. And so we're really looking at some different approaches to water financing that might work for reclamation customers and contractors specifically. On the management side, we're going to try to include provisions to remove barriers that prevent really common sense management of federal assets, from ensuring that we can use to the fullest extent possible the existing federal assets have an easier time getting to that type of management through the flood control, water control manuals, through use of Bureau of Reclamation excess capacity where it doesn't damage anybody else. I know there's been issues with that here in Colorado. It just makes sense that just on its face, it makes sense to make sure there's not federal policies that are standing in the way of better management. But I think it'll also drive better revenue from existing assets. It will cut red tape. It'll do all these things that'll really improve the infrastructure picture across the board. And so those are issues that we'll certainly be including in that bucket. Again, with the flood control manual modernization provisions that some have seen will likely be in there. Title transfers is a big one. We just had a hearing last week on Bureau of Reclamation title transfers. To the extent people want to take ownership of the projects they've paid for, we want to make sure that's easier. It makes sense. It allows for people to finance against their assets, and it relieves pressure on the federal budget. So we think there's a path forward there. There's some issues to work through, not the least of which is some of the power issues that I'm sure are of concern to many of you as well. I think we can work through them. The last bucket, if you will, is certainty. We've seen it throughout the West. I've personally seen it during my time working in Arizona. When you resolve the uncertainties that are out there in the water, it drives private investment. I mean, nobody wants to invest in something that they're not sure they're going to be able to recover the cost. And so we want to take steps to make sure some of those big uncertainties that are out there get resolved, whether it's state supremacy over water rights, the water transfer rule, which has been hanging out there for a long time and is big in pretty much every western state, including Alaska, which I'm always looking for those western water issues that have an Alaska nexus so I can tell my actual boss all the great stuff I'm doing. So there's a lot of things in there. The fish recovery programs like RIP, and there's some other ones that need to be reauthorized to ensure that water development can continue in light of the ESA concerns, and they're working. If there's Indian water rights settlements out there, those types of things should be included. They drive investment, they drive infrastructure, and I will certainly be making the case that that is an infrastructure play, providing that certainty. So many of the things I just laid out are at this point really Republican priorities. We've started to talk with our Democratic counterparts on the committee, but there's a lot in common on some of those. There's some things that I know that we can work through, and then there's going to be some difficult issues. I mean, there's no way around that. But we do know, as Christine referenced, whether it's the right way to approach it, but it's also the only way to approach it in a 51-49 Senate, is to find a bipartisan path forward, and get consensus where there is consensus. So there'll be challenges on some of these things. There's some folks that I feel oppose anything that helps water, that helps facilitate water development for whatever reason. Anything that tries to improve the process is classified as trying to gut the environmental rules, and it's just not what we're doing. If we look at the language, I mean, we can't do it, but it's not even what we're doing. We're trying to improve the process around the edges to provide more certainty, to provide more financing tools, and I think as we work through those issues, we can find a path forward. There's a willingness. I know there's a willingness, so it's just a matter of really working through, on both sides of the aisle, a matter of working through some of those issues. So that's all the fun stuff. That's all the kind of stuff I've enjoyed doing, but there's also the reality check, right? The big but. We always have to do the big but. And I think there's certainly going to be some challenges to an infrastructure bill, and really pretty much anything else we want to do in the Senate. Whether it's this broader infrastructure package that we don't really know what it looks like yet, or this water component, it's going to have to run quite a gauntlet to get through the Senate, I'd say. It seems to me, and we have 6 or 7 months before things, the political dynamics really get a little bit even crazier leading up to the midterm elections. So really right now is the time to start making some progress on these things. And everybody knows that, and there's a lot of effort being put into making progress right now. So I think the first thing I'd mention, and there's challenges even within kind of the water policy in a broader infrastructure package that are challenges too that we do need to think about. I think the first major challenge to any infrastructure bill is time. And not the 6 or 7 months I mentioned, but floor time on the Senate is always, at a premium, and that's a reality that's always there. But it's even more so right now as other priorities come up before the Senate that have to be dealt with now. I mean, think what we're dealing with, the spending bill and the immigration issue and all those things. Those have it's a want versus need type of scenario, and you have to take care of those issues first, and that takes up a lot of time. And and so the amount of floor time, actually physical, time to handle anything on the floor is limited, and that's made even more complicated, frankly, by what's going on with the nominations. We're having it's really causing a backlog. I know it's been a challenge. We're having to spend 30 hours, which can be, days and weeks of time on the Senate floor to move non-controversial nominees. And so, hopefully we can resolve some of that. It's above my pay grade certainly, but it is a challenge in terms of trying to put the puzzle together of how to move some of these things, including the energy bill that I mentioned before. And there are a lot of non-controversial folks Brenda, I think Commissioner Berman is a perfect example. It took 5 months to get her over the finish line, and she had no opposition. Well, she didn't have no opposition. I actually was proud of her. She earned a no vote from Bernie Sanders in committee. He didn't show up, but he did log a no vote, and so I think she has that bad. I mean, it would have been suspect if she got through with no opposition. I don't know. It would have been too easy, but so we have to resolve that. It's taking up a lot of time, and it's taking from some of these priorities, but it's something we can work through. Let's see. I wrote a lot on the nominees process, but I'm just moving on. I must have been on some tear at the time when So I think the other piece, aside from just strict Senate floor time as a challenge, is the challenge for Western water supply issues within the broader infrastructure context. And I think it really comes down to competition. There are a ton of infrastructure needs in this country. We all know it. We've all heard about them. But even within water, there's a lot of needs. And when you start talking about funding especially, the budget of the Bureau of Reclamation and some of the other kind of Western water-specific agencies is quickly swallowed by the needs of some of the older municipal systems in, whether it's Flint or Baltimore. I mean, there are billions and billions of dollars that are going to go to these cities, and it's easy to get lost in that. And so we really need to make it a priority to stay up on that list, and kind of separate ourselves to some degree from those types of projects, which make it difficult to fund water supply infrastructure versus kind of the treatment and delivery type of things. I think it's also a reason that, as I mentioned before, looking at some of these alternative financing and new approaches to how we can get things funded and built, how potentially getting things out of federal ownership can help that scenario. We have to look at all those things. We need to relook at them. Some of the older proposals that we've had, and we need to think of the new proposals, and I think that's going to be a necessity, whether there's an infrastructure program or not. I think, if there's a bill and there's some funding in there, it'll be temporary. We'll be back in the scenario again, so we need to think long-term about how we can approach some of these things. So really with that, I'll wrap up. As I mentioned, I hope that we'll have a proposal, a discussion draft of some kind on water supply infrastructure in the next week or two. You all will obviously see that and we encourage your feedback and let us know what works and what doesn't, and what and what you need. And with that, I'll turn it over and head down. I think, right? I don't need to hang for questions. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Lane, and thanks, Christine and Doug and others for giving us creatures of the Beltway to come and give our view from DC, but do it outside of the Beltway and have a chance to come to Colorado. So there you go. And Lane, brought something to mind before I get into the Farm Bill that, he did talk about nominations a lot, and that's a challenge we're having on the committee that I work on, the Senate Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee. Every new administration has quite a few political positions to fill, as you all know, and quite a few of those require Senate confirmation. So it sounds like the Energy Committee is a little behind pace. We have less than half of the political nominees that require Senate confirmation at USDA, the Department of Agriculture, and those folks haven't even been nominated. So it's not that we've struggled to move them through the Senate floor, but they haven't even been nominated. So that includes the Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment. That's the official that oversees the Forest Service. That's, many of you in this room know Harris Sherman. That's the job Harris had at the beginning of the last administration. And we're still waiting on that. So while we're working on the Farm Bill, which I'm going to talk about in a minute here, we're still going to have to process those nominees through our committee. And that's a really, as Lane mentioned, a really important responsibility that we take very seriously. So when I think about our agenda from now through the midterms, that's going to be an important part of it. But the big ticket item is the Farm Bill. Most of you are probably familiar with the bill. It's kind of the blueprint for federal policy that governs farming and ranching, but it's really more than the Farm Bill, right? It's private lands conservation, it's water infrastructure, it's federal land management through the forestry title, it's renewable energy and energy efficiency. A good portion of the funding that comes out of the Farm Bill is for food stamps. A lot of folks don't know that, but that's how we build this unique coalition that actually cuts through the normal partisan politics of DC and puts together enough votes for a Farm Bill, because you have rural interests who support some of the farm programs and other sorts of conservation and natural resources issues, and you've got urban constituencies who support the safety net programs like food stamps, or what's formally called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. So that's something we do in our committee about every 5 years. The last bill passed in early 2014, and it expires this coming September 30th. So we spent all of last year in our committee doing hearings, title by title. There are usually 12 or 13 titles of the Farm Bill, depending on what year it is. And we went through all those and heard from witnesses from Colorado and elsewhere all across the country to say, what's working, what can we improve, what's not working, we need to get rid of, and how can we allocate the dollars in a more efficient way. We finished those hearings last year, and towards the end of last year, and now the chairman, both in the House and the Senate, have moved to sort of putting pen to paper. So I work for Senator Debbie Stabenow, who's the ranking member of the Senate Agriculture, Nutrition, Forestry Committee, and our chairman is a guy named Pat Roberts from Kansas, just to the east of here. And then in the House, you have a gentleman named Congressman Mike Conaway from Texas, and he's writing the House Farm Bill. And both of them said recently that they hope to finish their writing, work through a committee markup process, and then move the bill to both the House and Senate floors by the end of the first quarter here, first quarter of 2018. So we're talking the next few months, we may have farm bills that have passed each chamber. And to Christine's point at the outset, this thing isn't going to work if it's not bipartisan. Our committees, I think, rise above a lot of the committees in Congress where we do have really good bipartisan cooperation, because these are just such critical issues to folks' livelihood out there. So we are, from our perspective, eternally optimistic that we're going to get this done this year, absolutely planning to work with our Republican counterparts, our committee members, those off the committee, to get a bill through the Senate, conferenced, reconciled with the House, and then passed and signed by the President before the bill expires at the end of September. However, I would be remiss if I didn't at least acknowledge that from time to time we have been late in getting this done. And Lane mentioned a little thing called the midterm elections coming up in November. And the closer you get to those, the more nervous, shall we say, that some members of Congress get about voting on big, complicated pieces of legislation. So we are going to really give it the old college try to get this thing done. That is my boss's plan. I know that that's the chairman's plan. But the last Farm Bill, I kind of alluded to it, but we passed the Senate bill in 2012, and I mentioned it didn't get enacted until 2014. What happened then was we had a strong vote in the Senate, 70 votes, and the House, I guess it was Speaker Boehner at the time, put the bill on the House floor, and it failed. And that's like an unprecedented thing when the Speaker puts a bill on the floor and then it doesn't get the votes. So we just couldn't figure it out. The House guys didn't want to vote for this food stamps program, so we ran out of time and we had to come back and redo it in 2014. That stuff happens. It's not the end of the world for rural America. We do extensions. USDA has flexibility on this stuff, but I suppose I didn't want to leave everyone with the impression that this isn't going to be a challenge, because it is a 1,000-plus page bill with a lot of different constituencies and different issues that cut across one another. So, I think I'll just wrap up by saying a lot of you folks live in rural parts of the state and rural parts of the country. We know that commodity prices are down. We have huge natural resource challenges. We have a significant lack of broadband and high-speed internet infrastructure in rural parts of America, and that's stuff that the Farm Bill helps with. You can't compete in a 21st century economy if you don't have broadband. And these are all things that we feel very strongly about addressing in this next Farm Bill and getting done. And we're gonna keep moving forward. Like I said, probably in the next couple months, have a bill and do a markup. And I've met with several folks in this room about their priorities. Look forward to continuing those meetings and hearing from a lot of you. And I guess we'll probably move to questions. Is that right? Yeah. Thank you.
So just quickly before we go to questions, I want to just acknowledge that we always enjoy a good working relationship with the local congressional staff offices. I haven't had a chance to see who all is here, but my friend John Whitney likes to sit with us and chew the fat about what's going on from Senator Bennett's office. He's with us. I don't know, are there others from the congressional offices here that I have not seen? Okay, so with that, we were going to take questions from the floor, but we'll go ahead and have them take them up here because the mic's not working. So questions for these two.
Shout them out. Somebody's calling with a question.
Over there?
Melinda Casson with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership.
Maybe we've got a mic now.
Hi. Melinda Casson with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. I could ask lots of questions, but I guess with regard to, I'll start with Lane on infrastructure. One of the things that people in Colorado and this part of the West care a lot about is the Colorado River. We have used in Colorado to great advantage the system conservation pilot program, or whatever. People have different names for it. Arizona has a different name for it. The question is, in terms of when you talk about financing, and is that the kind of innovative financing that you're talking about, where you've got cities partnering with reclamation, doing grants that have match, or are you talking about giving the Bureau its own version of a WIFIA or a TIFIA? What is it? Can you give us a little more about the kind of program that you're thinking about with regard to financing?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, what I was primarily referencing, and what we've been working on pretty extensively, is a WIFIA-like program that is a loan program that leverages both that uses federal funds to help leverage additional private investment, that helps bring down borrowing costs on at least the federal component, and provide some of the links in terms of timeframes and repayment periods and things like that. So that's what we're looking at. There's a lot of kind of variables in there that'll be important to work on, from especially as it relates to federal infrastructure, because there's all kinds of extra complications there. But the system conservation is part of and the Colorado River in general, frankly, is part of the conversation in this bill as well. But I would put that in a separate category. Certainly, I think that kind of that program where it's more of a funding program. I mean, there's state matches and there's local matches and all these things, but it's in a little bit of a different, more funding category in my mind when I talk about these things. So, and actually, I was just having conversations about that yesterday before I came out here.
Chris.
Wait for the mic.
I didn't say a word. Thanks so much for coming out and joining us, both of you. Sean, on your side, you were asked to speak to the Farm Bill. You did that very well. Thank you. On the other side, on another issue, care to offer your forecasts on forest health and the correction to fire borrowing, and another issue that is all about watershed safety and security for us in the West?
Is this one? Oh, okay, good. So, great segue, Chris. Our next session is about that very issue. Very briefly, I think that there are a couple different conversations across several committees in Congress. And we'll probably get into the details a little bit more in the next session, but part of the natural resources bill that Lane mentioned has a whole forestry title that Senators Murkowski and Cantwell put together. The Farm Bill has a forestry title. There's a whole separate discussion, as many of you know, because it led to this government shutdown, about how we deal with the spending for the rest of the fiscal year and what the top line budget caps that Congress allocates themselves to use those dollars to fill, how that's all going to come together. And there's been a discussion about forestry in that context as well. So all of those conversations really center around this huge issue of the Forest Service's broken budget, where they're spending over 50%, growing to 2/3 in a couple years here of their entire budget, $5 billion agency, fighting wildfires. That number is up from 16% in 1995. So you just think about that delta there. That is an incredible challenge for any agency to lose half their budget to an unforeseen, not totally unforeseen, but a set of things you didn't have to spend money on just 20 years before. So I think we'll get into that a little bit more, but it's a top of mind issue for Lane's committee, our committee, some other folks, and I think if you're not already hearing a lot about it, you'll continue to hear more about it.
I would just add briefly, because I know you're going to talk about it, and I totally agree, there's a lot of conversations going on. But as Chris, as you know, when we talk about water infrastructure, we continue to talk about watersheds as well. I think it is certainly taking a different path to resolution, but we will continue to harp on that, because in the three categories that I laid out earlier, it fits in almost every one. I mean, it's a storage component, it's a management component. We're filling up reservoirs with sediment because it's not being taken care of. It's a major water issue, and so we're not going to, at least in speaking about it, we're going to continue to focus on that. In terms of legislating on it, I know the water sector will have a major, role in that, but it's kind of on a on its own path, which I think is good.
Other questions? Over there?
I belong to several livestock organizations and farm organizations, and we probably spend more time on the Endangered Species Act and more time and money on that act than probably anything that we do. And I know the water people here do the same thing. I think that amendments to the act to make it have more sense needs to be a top priority. Do you see that in the future at all?
Thanks. Yeah, obviously this issue's been hanging around for a very long time. Not to get too inside the Beltway, our committee doesn't actually have jurisdiction over ESA or ESA reform at all in the Senate. We have a lot of the impacts between the land management agencies, the water management agencies, all the people, the stuff you deal with every day. The impacts are felt in the agencies we have jurisdiction over, but taking up strict reform isn't something we could do. I know there are efforts and there's discussions. It will never be an easy path forward. I don't know the details of those. I know that over the last few Congresses, there's been an effort to, for lack of a better way to say it, take whatever you can get in terms of making it the program work better, and then start again rather than trying to get it all and trying to find a path forward on something. It's a difficult issue. It adds a lot of cost in permitting. So we are working on something. I mean, I think some of the things we're working on in terms of permit streamlining and things are driven by ESA, frankly, but we can really only get at it around the edges.
And I think I would say that from our committee's perspective, that's a sentiment that we've heard for years, and I think is starting to break through in a little bit more meaningful way where hardliners on keeping the ESA regulations and all the same as they were since 1973 are starting to realize that there are some problems. Livestock industry is one. We've got issues with approvals of crop protection materials, and I take a lot of meetings on that. And I think that but to Lane's point, that it is difficult to legislate on this issue, and there's been a lot of attempts over the last several years to bills to reform the Endangered Species Act and to streamline the Endangered Species Act. And what happens every time, just frankly, is that proponents of reform write a bill on their own. They don't reach out to wildlife groups or other conservation groups that care about the act. They introduce the bill. Those wildlife groups get their allies in Congress to oppose the bill. Everyone digs in their heels, and we do nothing. And maybe this is too idealistic of me, but I think that the way forward on this and so many of our thorny issues is to actually try and sit down around a table with those warring factions and say, where can we see eye to eye that there are some obstacles with how the act's being implemented or a certain provision, and try and come up with some consensus solutions from the sort of radical center rather than the far left or the far right. Some of that's happening right now. And some of those wildlife and conservation groups have started to have some of those conversations. But for those who are interested in ESA, we've tried the way that the former, and it just hasn't worked. So I would suggest reaching out to some of your colleagues, on the other side of the aisle or on sort of the other side of the political spectrum, and trying to have that conversation about, is there any reforms we could do legislatively? If not, how do we go to the relevant agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Marine Fisheries Service, and not as pertinent here, but some places, and talk to them about administrative efficiencies and what they have the authority and the flexibility to do already. That's starting, and I think that the path forward on this issue is going to be more of that rather than let's put out a bill that really never has a snowball's chance in hell in passing Congress.
And just one thing, I mean, I mentioned the Upper Colorado Fish Recovery Program. I mean, on the water side, that is paying for ESA compliance. I mean, that's working, right? It's allowing for water development while in light of these fish issues, and we see it a few other places. So that's one approach, if it can be translated, where, I mean, I think that's money well spent to make sure we can do what we need to do on the water side, and make sure we're compliant with the ESA as it is. I mean, it's expensive, but it's money well spent if you can continue to operate. And so maybe there's some models like that. And I think there will be reform efforts somewhere, but in light of whether those happen or not, I mean, we need to continue to work on a path forward.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. I think that we'll need to wrap up for today. Please, a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.